In a previous video, we looked at the idea of this does not mean that. And specifically, we looked at the verse James 1:17, where it says that every good gift comes from above, but that does not mean that only good gifts come from above. Just because every good gift comes from above does not mean that only good gifts come from above. This does not mean that. And the idea of this, I guess you could call it a series, is that oftentimes when we're reading the Bible, we'll read something and we'll say, oh, so this must mean that. And so then we say, well, the Bible says this, but actually it doesn't say this. It says this. And when you mix the two up, you're going to have problems. Attributing something to a source doesn't mean that the source only has one effect. Oh, well, this is from God. Does that mean that that's the only thing that God does? Oh, well, I prayed for healing and the healing came from God. So God only heals? No. See what I mean? Like there's we got to start looking at things for more of what does it intend to say. And today's a little bit of a tricky one. It's found in Isaiah chapter 3. And the specific verse, I will pull it up right here. Isaiah chapter 3 verse 12 says this: Youths oppress my people, children oppress my people, women rule over them. My people, your guides lead you astray. They turn from the path. So the idea here is that, there's women leaders, and this is like, okay, so what people do is they read this and they say, okay, so this must mean that women should not be leaders. This must mean that women only lead because of sin or immorality. That's not what it said at all. Like, that's not what it said. Are these two statements the same? Listen very closely, and ask yourself if these two statements are the same. Number one, because of a lack of leadership, women will have to lead. Women are bad leaders and should never lead for any reason. See, what people have done is in the past, they've taken those two things and they've put them together. Okay, yes. Because of a lack of leadership, women will have to lead in this passage that Isaiah is talking about. That must mean that women are not fit leaders. They should never lead for any reason whatsoever because they're terrible at it. It's not their place. To lead is to just step all over God. And the thing is, I'm not even going to bring up, well, I'm going to bring it up. I'm not going to discuss deeply the idea of solo women missionaries who have gone overseas and ministered to people without being married. So, I mean, obviously, there's one thing there. And then another thing is sometimes people think because a wife should be subject to her husband, which a husband should probably be subject to his wife too, that must mean that all women should be subject to all men. And those are, once again, that's we'll probably look at that at a different time too. That's clearly not what's being said here. Okay? So are these two statements the same? Because of a lack of leadership, women will have to lead, and women are bad leaders that should never lead for any reason? No, they're two completely different statements. They mean two completely different things. And we would do well not to mix them together. So let's look at the actual context of Isaiah chapter 3. What is he talking about? Is he just randomly picking on women? Like, God says to do this and this. Oh yeah, and by the way, just in case anybody was, women, terrible leaders, God says that they should never lead for any reason. Okay. What? Like, what? So let's look at the actual context. What's happening in Isaiah chapter 3? And we'll back up a little bit. He starts in verse 1. See now the Lord Almighty. This is the New International Version. I know a lot of people don't like it. I just got it so that we would all understand what was being said. I could easily read from the NASB or ESV, or if you'd rather, we could try reading from the Hebrew. However, I want something that actually, that you can understand. And so I'm just picking this translation. What good does it do if I read from the King James or the ESV and I have to explain what we're reading? That just doesn't do any good. See now, the Lord Almighty is about to take from Jerusalem and Judah, both supply and support, all supplies of food and all supplies of water, the hero and the warrior, the judge and the prophet, the diviner and the elder, the captain of 50 and the man of rank, the counselor, skilled craftsman, and clever enchanter. Verse 4, I will make mere youths their officials, children will rule over them. So we actually have the mention of children leaders before we get later where it starts talking about women ruling. Okay, now obviously we could look at the book of Kings and say, well, what about Athaliah or Jezebel? What about these evil women? That's a fair point, because you have in the book of Kings you have a bunch of male leaders, and then you have the only example of female leaders in the book of Kings are evil women. That is a fair point. Does that mean that there are only evil women? Let's look, for instance, at the history of Israel. Israel did not have one single righteous king. Not one single righteous king. And none of them were David's descendants. Does that mean that all men are evil and that they will never do any good? Well, no. Well, then, okay, if we can't use that argument to say that there are only evil male leaders, we can't use that argument to say that there are only evil female leaders. It is unfortunate that Kings only gives us bad examples of female leadership, especially in examples where the women had opportunities to do what was right. But we see, for instance, in the book of Esther, a good example of a female who did a great service, and Jezebel could have done the same thing. She could have helped Ahab to achieve spiritual greatness, just like Esther helped, obviously, the Persian king, to save, Israel. So, I mean, it seems to me that that's more of an issue of character, and we'll look at that in a second. But just because there weren't any good female leaders in the book of Kings doesn't mean that there can't be. Okay, for instance, I believe that a woman can be an elder, a woman can be a pastor. Why is there no woman pastor at our church? Because there's no woman that qualifies for the role, no woman that fits it, no woman that we don't really need, that we don't have an opening. That's like kind of like the big issue. But then the secondary to that is there's really no one that's like, oh, we have to get that person on the board. Why? I mean, that doesn't just go for women either. That goes for men too. We don't really have any openings. There's no one that really fits the position anyways. That's not a knock against women or against the people in the church. That's just, in time, there will be an opening. Why? Because people die, because people step down from positions. In the future, that will be a discussion that we revisit. For the now, it's not a discussion we revisit, not because there's anything wrong with it, just because it's no need for it. I mean, I could also look at the idea of who is a good match if I need to get remarried. But why would I need to do that? I'm already married. There's no reason to be looking for a replacement. You get what I'm saying? Like, it's just not a necessary thing. So, when we look at the book of Kings, notice that it's not saying anything about women always being evil. In fact, it goes to great lengths to mention that the one evil woman was related to the other evil woman. And that's kind of a big point that it's trying to make, like, hey, these two people. And the point there is more about the wickedness of the people of Canaan that Israel didn't drive out. That's more the point there. So we really see in the book of Kings that there really was no opportunity for women to rule. Jezebel, for instance, she didn't rule by herself. Her husband was the actual guy. She just had strong influence in the situation. Or you take the situation where the Athaliah, I believe it was, killed off a bunch of the heirs. Why? Because there was an heir. There was no need for a woman ruler. She took the role where it didn't need to be. So that kind of gives us a lot of insight here into Isaiah. The issue is not women leading. The issue is that the women were having to lead. Well, why were they having to lead? Now, hold on. Let's look at this, okay? Stupid thing. On, where is it? Isaiah chapter 3, we looked at verse 4, I will make mere youths their officials, children will rule over them. And then if you hop down to verse 6, it says, a man will seize one of his brothers in his father's house and say, you have a cloak, you be our leader. Take charge of this heap of ruins. See, there's no leadership. So there's two issues in Isaiah chapter 3 that I'm specifically focusing on. Number one, there was no leadership. So women were having to step up, children were having to step up because there was no leader. And then the second thing, not just was there no leaders, but the men were not stepping up and doing what they were supposed to be doing. So the women were having to do it. That was the issue. There's no leadership going on. And then if you look down at verse 14, right here, the Lord enters into judgment against the elders and leaders of his people. It is you who have ruined my vineyard. Did you? I'll read that again in case you missed it. The Lord enters into judgment against the elders and leaders of his people. This is a specific situation that's going on. The leaders are not doing a good job, and the men are not doing what he called them to be doing. So now, he's going into judgment against them because they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. This should obviously give a clear indicator of what's going on with the whole women ruler things. So, okay, the verse before, verse 12, woe to the wicked. Disaster is upon them. They will be paid back for their hands have done. For what their hands have done. Verse 12, you suppress my people. The unstrong are attacking my people. Women rule over them. The men aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing. The leaders are pitiful. My people, your guides, lead you astray. They turn you from the path. Verse 13, the Lord takes his place in court. He rises to judge the people. Verse 14, the Lord enters into judgment against the elders and leaders of his people. So when you look at the bigger context, he's not saying out of nowhere, oh, but by the way, here's a bunch of decrees from God, and by the way, women are terrible leaders. That's not even the point. You're not doing your job. You leaders, I'm going to have to punish you for what you're doing. Other people are having to do your job. Children are taking advantage of you. This is pitiful. See what I mean? When you look at the actual context, it changes things quite a bit. So, can women lead? Well, women leading is completely irrelevant to the passage of of Isaiah chapter 3. And you might say completely irrelevant? Well, in a way. Because he's not trying to make the argument of whether or not women should ever lead in any situation. That's not his point. That's not what he's talking about at all. He's simply talking about the leaders not doing their job. Okay? So, the main point, the leaders weren't leading and the men weren't doing their job. They were sitting back and cowering while other people had to pick up the slack and do their job for them. Let me give you a modern example. There's a man and a woman, maybe they're husband and wife, maybe they're boyfriend girlfriend, I don't know. And the boyfriend does not take his leadership role overly seriously, or husband. Maybe he sits around playing video games all day. Maybe he doesn't even read his Bible. Maybe he's just like, bleh, whatever. And he leaves the spiritual raising to the wife, the order of the house to the wife or the woman, girlfriend, whatever. The raising of the child to the woman. So now he's abdicated from his role of leadership and influence in any way whatsoever. And so the woman is having to do it for him. It's not that women should not raise their children. It's not that women shouldn't have a role in their house. It's not any of those things. It's that the man should get up off of his butt, stop playing video games for 5 seconds, and contribute to the household. That is a very applicable example. So because you're sitting around playing video games all day, women are having to take care of this. It's an issue of shame. That you are not doing your job, and she's having to do it for you. A man's job, in large part, is to protect his house, to support his wife, to defend his family. And that's exactly the opposite of what's going on in Isaiah chapter 3. Nowhere to be found. You're leaving the job to the people who you should be supporting. You see the difference there? And that's what Isaiah chapter 3 is talking about. So, as a result of what's going on with the leadership and the men not doing their job, everybody was scrambling around in lawlessness. People were just kind of doing whatever. And then he goes on to talk about the adultery going on, and that's something else. But I'm not really going to look at that because we're not going to look at all of chapter 3. I just want to give you the idea of what's going on. The Bible, this is something that blows people away, but believe it or not, the Bible nowhere actually teaches that women can't lead. What people do is they get kind of their tradition and their bias on the situation, and then they go to the Bible, and then they find verses that support their bias. I'll tell you a really common one. Okay, I actually wrote it down here. Where is it? Women need to have a certain appearance. They need to wear dresses, have long hair. They need to be child raisers and nothing else. They shouldn't probably even leave the house. They should just be good little submissive women and not have an opinion about anything. They shouldn't be able to contribute to what we are spending our house's finances on, and so I can nag her for spending on the credit card, but she can't nag me for what I spend because I'm the man, so I can spend foolishly. Yeah, because that sounds like something God would have said, right? And so what people do is they get a certain idea, and then they look to the Bible to answer it. You see people going to the other extreme too. Feminists, for instance, they try and twist things, and if they can't twist it, then they say, well, the Bible's outdated. It's irrelevant. It has nothing to do with it. So because I have a bad attitude, that must mean that I'm going to reject what God has revealed. You see people do this all the time. If a woman has a problem with a man, with men, you watch this. If a woman has a problem with men, she'll take the verses where Paul says very specific things about that, and then they'll say, nope, that's not from God. That's just sexist. Paul was just trying to, spread his male agenda. And women aren't the only people who do this. Feminists aren't the only people who do this. I mean, anything that is about men. Well, you need to submit to me. You need to give me sex whenever I want because of this one verse. Well, actually, that verse says that men should be submitting their bodies to their wife too. So, under that argument, if the wife says no sex and the man says sex, that would mean that they're both having to submit to each other, and you now have a draw. See, people don't like to actually read the Bible. They like to read the Bible so much as it affirms their own opinion. And there's a lot of times where there's almost like a marital rape kind of situation happening, where the one person's like, no, you hurt my feelings, I really don't want to do this right now, and the other person pressures them into it. Here's the thing. If your spouse isn't wanting to have sex, there's probably a good reason for it. Maybe you're ignoring them. Maybe maybe they suspect you of cheating. There's all kinds of different things. And maybe you should have a conversation with them and kind of connect with them as a person rather than using them as a sex relief. Just throwing it out there. The idea that a wife can't have any contribution to her own marriage is just completely wrong. And the problem is that a generation ago they taught this. They taught this stuff in churches. And so there's still now women today in their 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s who think that this is what the Bible teaches. And so some of them are just super bitter about it. Some of them are, hell-bent on this is how husbands and wives need to act. And it's like, okay, let's calm down with that. I mean, take, for instance, the role of women. In the country, women are able to do manual labor, right? Lift a bale of hay. But in the city, it's like, you make your wife carry that? It's like, I didn't make her do anything. She did it. What do you want me to do? Stand over her back and say, you get what I'm saying? Stupid nonsense. Or do they think that I'm going to have to be around my wife 24 hours of every day to make sure that I'm constantly there to carry things? My wife's not an invalid. I mean, come on. Jeez. So the Bible does not actually teach anything about women not leading. In fact, it kind of seems to lean the other direction. If you look at, for instance, the book of Proverbs, chapter 31, it talks about, the wife of character and all these things. And if you read through you'd be surprised at some of the things that it mentions. A wife can leave the house. She's not required to stay in the house. A wife can do much more than just raise children. She can trade, she can make purchases, she can have a job. It actually says in Proverbs 31 that she went out and bought a field. And then she went and was farming in the field. So we see from that the idea that a wife has to stay at home wearing dresses, raising children all day is completely not accurate. And remember that Proverbs 31 is not, that's not a checklist that a wife has to go through and say, okay, I did this, I did that. So then some people come along, they say something along the lines of this. Well, back then, women were just seen as possessions. Well, not necessarily. It might seem like that to our modern eyes, but I found in my studies of the ancient world that that's not exactly true. I mean, obviously there were the excesses, there were the people who did do things like that, there were the abuses of the system. There's always abuses of the system, any system, but that's not really the teaching that the Bible has. And there were also different eras. You know, for instance, you can't say, in the days of the Bible. Well, that's a big freaking span of time. Moses was around 1400s. The kingdom of Israel was around like the 800s and 900s. And okay, so there's like, right there is a span of 500 years. You can't say in the days of the Bible. That's a big freaking thing. And then Jesus was in AD. So you can't just say in the time of the Bible. Yes, there were times when women were not treated accurately, or I mean not accurately, well, and but nowhere in the Bible does it actually tell us to treat them not well. In fact, if you look at the Bible, you see the men actually treating their wives with distinction. And that's kind of a big issue. I mean, if you just look at, for instance, in just one example, is in 1 Samuel, where Hannah is treated so well by her husband, who has 2 wives. Yes, I know that. It was a common practice of the time. I'm not condoning it. The Bible doesn't condone it either. It just mentions that they did have more than one wife at that time. Which, once again, there were other times in Israelite history where nobody had more than one wife, because you couldn't afford it. So, you can't really say, hey, this is just the way it was. It wasn't necessarily that's the way that it was. So, were women seen as possessions among some people at certain times? Yes. Does the Bible teach that women should be seen as possessions? No. That is more of our inability to understand what was happening rather than it was what was actually happening. If you read the law and you already think that women were seen as possessions in the law, then that's what you're going to see. But if you go to the law and try to understand for what it was, you're going to see that women were not treated like that. Or seen like that, or taught to be seen like that. Some people just want to find something in the law, so they find it. Which I wish that I could talk more about that, but I can't. Romans 16:1 talks about women in leadership. It talks about a deacon or deaconess. That's kind of a big deal there. In fact, the only position that I know of that is not specifically said that a woman can or did do it was that of a pastor, and I'm convinced that does not mean that she can't, just that she didn't. When Paul's talking about pastors, he says when anyone desires. He could have very easily said when a man desires to be a pastor. Instead, he said when anyone desires. It is a good thing. And so then, it says later, well, the wife, this is the role of the wife of a husband. First off, we're not even sure about that translation. But second off, even if that is the correct translation, that doesn't mean that for all time. That just means that he was talking to people that did not have a female pastor, and so he was talking about their wives. See, what people do is they go to the Bible and then they remove it from the historical context it was written in, and they just come to their own conclusions. In the book of some people bring this up. In the book of Judges, what about Deborah, who led? Judges is actually a book about poor leadership and no leadership, and Deborah went because the guy didn't want to. So the bringing up Deborah in the argument kind of seems a little bit like not a real reasonable thing to do, because that's exactly what Isaiah 3 is talking about. Men not doing their jobs, and so women having to step up. which is the entire theme of the book of Judges. So maybe let's not bring up Judges. In 1 Corinthians, women were mentioned to prophesy, which means, by the way, that they can speak in church and they can be used in the gifts. Both things that have been drastically taken out of context. A woman must be silent. Yeah, maybe you should read the whole context. Silent doesn't mean absolute quietness. It means more of a reserved reverence. Anyways, or if you look at, I believe it's in the book of Acts, where Aquila and Priscilla are pulling this guy aside to correct him, Priscilla takes the lead on it. The wife takes the lead. Kind of a big point there. And so it seems like the issue is more with character than gender. Women, in the book of Philippians, the women were fighting. That was something that Paul addressed. Or when they were shooting off their mouths and causing a distraction in 1 Corinthians, Paul addressed that. It's not so much an issue of women so much as is about their character while they're doing it. And so one last thing, between me and my wife, I have an easier time with the day. Easier time. You know what? Actually, don't really have time for that. We're going to go ahead and stop there. I hope that this kind of gives you a little bit of a deeper understanding about Isaiah chapter